Before her name became synonymous with hiding, loss, and remembrance, Anne Frank was simply a child, growing up in a world that still felt stable. Born in 1929, she entered life during a period when Europe was recovering from one war and unaware of how close it was to another. Her earliest years were shaped not by fear, but by family routines, school days, and the small dramas of childhood that felt endless and important. Anne's home life was structured yet warm. She grew up in a household that valued conversation, education, and curiosity. Family meals were moments of discussion, humour, and shared presence. Her parents encouraged questions and independence, and Anne absorbed the atmosphere quickly. She learned early how to observe people, how to listen, and how to express herself, skills that would later define her voice. School was a central part of her early world. Anne enjoyed learning, but more than lessons, she enjoyed interaction. She was talkative, energetic, and socially alert. Teachers recognized her intelligence, but also her tendency to speak her mind. She was not a quiet child, nor a withdrawn one. She thrived on attention, friendship, and the feeling of being noticed. Her imagination set her apart. Anne invented stories, exaggerated moments, and turned ordinary events into narratives. Writing was not yet a refuge, but a playground. She used words to entertain herself and others, testing how language could shape reality. Even in childhood, she showed a natural instinct for storytelling, capturing emotions rather than just facts. Friendships mattered deeply to her. Anne cared intensely about belonging, about being liked, about how she was seen by others. Small conflicts felt large, and minor joys felt overwhelming. These emotional swings were not signs of fragility, but of engagement with life. She experienced the world fully, without distance or detachment. At this stage, politics and ideology remained distant. The changes unfolding across Europe had not yet reached her inner world. Restrictions, labels, and fear had not entered her vocabulary. Identity was still personal rather than imposed. She was not defined by religion, background, or danger, but by personality. What makes this period essential is not its innocence alone, but its normality. Anne Frank was not born into tragedy. She grew into it. The girl who would later write from confinement once moved freely through classrooms and streets, worried about schoolwork and friendships rather than survival. This contrast gives her later words their power. Understanding Anne before the darkness matters, because it restores her humanity. She was not a symbol when she was a child. She was a living, changing person with ordinary hopes and ordinary flaws. The war did not create her voice, it interrupted it. And in that interruption, the world would later hear not just what was lost, but who she had been before everything changed. When German forces entered the Netherlands in 1940, Amsterdam did not collapse into immediate chaos. At first, daily life appeared to continue with an uneasy calm. Shops remained open, trams still ran, and people tried to believe that occupation would be temporary. Yet beneath this surface normality, the city was already changing. Authority shifted quietly but decisively into hands that governed through control rather than consent. For Jewish families, the changes came faster and cut deeper. New regulations appeared one after another, each small on its own, but devastating in accumulation. Identification papers were altered, professions were restricted, public spaces slowly closed their doors. What had once been an open city became a map of invisible boundaries. Anne Frank was still a child, but she sensed the tightening atmosphere even before she fully understood it. Schools became one of the first clear dividing lines. Jewish children were forced out of their classrooms and separated from their friends. What had been social life turned into enforced isolation. Anne, once energetic and surrounded by peers, now found her world shrinking. The occupation did not arrive with a single violent moment. It seeped into routine, turning ordinary activities into reminders of exclusion. Fear entered daily conversation. Arrests, disappearances, and rumours circulated through neighbourhoods. Families spoke in lowered voices, measuring every decision. The question was no longer how to live well, but how to avoid notice. Amsterdam, once a place of movement and trade, became a city where stillness felt safer than visibility. The decision to go into hiding was not sudden, but it became urgent. When the call-up notice arrived, demanding that Anne's sister Margot report for forced labour, any remaining illusions collapsed. The family understood what such notices meant. Waiting was no longer an option. Survival now required disappearance. The building at Prinsengracht was not chosen for comfort, but for possibility. Behind the ordinary facade of offices and warehouses, a hidden space existed, concealed, awkward, and unseen from the street. The move into the secret annex was swift and deliberate. The family left behind their visible lives, stepping into a place where silence and discipline would replace freedom. Crossing into the annex marked a psychological rupture. The world outside did not vanish, but it became inaccessible. Windows were covered, movement was restricted, sound became dangerous. Anne, used to expression and interaction, entered a space where restraint governed every action. Childhood curiosity collided with the demands of concealment. The annex itself was not a refuge in the traditional sense. It was cramped, shadowed, and shaped by tension. Every creak of the stairs, every unfamiliar noise from below, carried threat. Yet within these walls, a fragile sense of order had to be maintained. Routine became protection. Cooperation became necessity. Anne's perception of time shifted almost immediately. Days lost their shape, measured no longer by school bells or social plans, but by meals, quiet hours, and fear of interruption. The occupation followed them inside, not through soldiers, but through anticipation. Anticipation of discovery, of betrayal, of noise that could not be taken back. The secret annex was not just a hiding place, it was a narrowing of existence. Amsterdam continued beyond its walls under occupation, but Anne's world contracted into rooms, whispers, and thoughts. The shadow of Nazi control reached even here, not through direct force, but through the constant knowledge that safety depended on remaining unseen. Life in the secret annex was defined less by what happened than by what had to be avoided. Silence was not a preference, it was a rule that governed every movement. During working hours in the building below, footsteps were measured, objects lifted carefully, voices reduced to whispers. Even laughter carried risk. Ordinary sounds became potential threats, and the body learned to remain tense for hours at a time. Fear did not arrive as panic, but as persistence. It settled into routine. Every unfamiliar noise, a door slamming, a voice in the stairwell, footsteps that lingered too long, triggered the same internal calculation. Was this the moment of discovery, or just another false alarm? The uncertainty never resolved. It simply reset, day after day. The physical space amplified emotional strain. Rooms were small, shared, and unavoidable. Privacy barely existed. Disagreements had nowhere to go, frustrations nowhere to dissipate. Minor habits became sources of irritation, and silence often carried more tension than argument. Living so closely meant that every emotion echoed. Time itself changed shape, days blurred together, stripped of external markers. There were no seasons felt through movement, no casual errands, no spontaneous encounters. The outside world existed only through fragments: radio broadcasts, muffled sounds from the street, distant rumours. Life continued elsewhere, but not here. For Anne, confinement sharpened self-awareness. She observed not only others, but herself, her impatience, her fears, her shifting moods. The lack of distraction forced introspection. Thoughts that might have passed unnoticed in a normal life now demanded attention. Growing up did not pause in hiding. It intensified. In this constrained world, writing became Anne's escape, without movement. The diary offered her a place where she could speak freely without endangering anyone. On its pages, she did not have to whisper. She could argue, confess, exaggerate, and reflect. Language restored a sense of control that space denied her. The act of writing gave structure to days that otherwise threatened to dissolve. Putting experiences into words transformed fear into narrative. It did not erase danger, but it gave it form. By writing, Anne could step back from events and examine them, rather than being consumed by them. The diary also became a companion. In isolation, it listened without judgment. Anne addressed it as if it were a friend, a way of sustaining dialogue in a life where expression was restricted. Through this imagined conversation, she preserved a sense of relationship with the world beyond the annex. Writing allowed Anne to assert identity against erasure. Under occupation, individuals were reduced to categories and restrictions. In her diary, Anne insisted on complexity. She wrote not only about fear, but about irritation, hope, ambition, and longing. These entries resisted the flattening force of persecution by insisting on inner life. Over time, her writing matured. The diary shifted from observation to reflection, from description to analysis. Anne questioned human nature, injustice, and her own contradictions. The confined space accelerated this growth. Cut off from external experience, she turned inward and developed a voice that was thoughtful, sharp, and increasingly self-aware. The diary also functioned as quiet defiance. In a system designed to silence and disappear people like her, Anne documented existence. Each page asserted presence. Each sentence refused anonymity. Writing became an act of endurance, proof that thought and imagination could survive even when movement could not. Life in hiding narrowed Anne's physical world, but writing expanded her inner one. The annex restricted her body, but the diary preserved her voice. In that balance between confinement and expression, survival took on a new meaning, not just staying alive, but remaining fully human while doing so. Adolescence does not pause for war, and it does not soften for confinement. For Anne Frank, growing up inside the secret annex meant that every emotional shift unfolded under pressure. The normal turbulence of adolescence, identity, independence, desire for recognition, had no external outlet. Feelings that might have been eased by distance or distraction instead intensified within the same walls, among the same people, every day. Conflicts became inevitable. Small disagreements carried disproportionate weight because there was nowhere to retreat. Arguments with adults, especially with her mother, reflected not just generational tension, but the strain of living without privacy. Anne struggled to be understood as an individual rather than as a child who should adapt quietly. Her growing sense of self collided with the expectations of constant caution and restraint. At the same time, Anne's inner world expanded. She questioned who she was becoming and who she wanted to be if freedom ever returned. Dreams of independence, love, and creative achievement took shape in contrast to her confinement. These aspirations were not naive escapes. They were acts of imagination that resisted stagnation. To imagine a future was to refuse the idea that the present was permanent. Romantic feelings also emerged, tentative and confusing. In the unnatural closeness of hiding, emotions developed quickly and awkwardly. Anne explored attraction and vulnerability, while still surrounded by fear. These experiences were not sheltered, they were compressed. Adolescence arrived without preparation, unfolding in an environment that allowed no mistakes to fade quietly. Despite tension, Anne continued to believe in growth. She wrote about becoming someone better, wiser, more capable of understanding others. The annex did not stop her from maturing, it accelerated it. Responsibility, reflection, and self-critique arrived early, shaped by the knowledge that life could be interrupted at any moment. Alongside emotional growth ran a constant undercurrent of fear. Discovery was not an abstract danger, it was immediate and unpredictable. A dropped object, a loud step, a voice from the wrong direction could end everything. Fear trained attention to details that others never notice. Silence was not absence, it was vigilance. Nighttime often brought the deepest anxiety. Sounds travelled differently after dark, and imagination filled the gaps left by uncertainty. Footsteps outside, doors opening in the building, unfamiliar voices, all carried the same question. Is this the moment? Sleep came unevenly, interrupted by alertness that never fully relaxed. The fear was collective, but it was experienced individually. Each person processed it differently, leading to misunderstandings and tension. Some withdrew, others became irritable. Anne felt the pressure sharply, aware that a single mistake could endanger everyone. This knowledge weighed heavily on her sense of responsibility. What made the fear especially cruel was its repetition. Nothing had to happen for terror to return. The same noises recurred, the same alarms rose and fell, without resolution. Relief was always temporary. The threat did not escalate, it endured. Yet even under this pressure, life continued in fragments. Conversations resumed after scares. Meals were prepared. Writing continued. This persistence did not mean fear was conquered, it meant it was carried. Courage in this space was not dramatic. It was the decision to keep going despite the knowledge that safety was never guaranteed. Growing up behind closed doors meant learning that hope and fear could exist at the same time. Anne lived in that tension, imagining a future while listening for footsteps that might erase it. Her adolescence was shaped not by freedom, but by awareness. And in that awareness, she recorded not only what it meant to be hunted, but what it meant to keep becoming oneself anyway. The end did not arrive with warning or escalation. It came on an ordinary day, in the middle of routines that had become habits. After more than 2 years in hiding, the secret annex was exposed not by chance, but by human action. Someone spoke. A phone call was made. Silence, which had protected them for so long, was suddenly irrelevant. The raid unfolded with speed and authority. German and Dutch officers entered the building at Prinsengracht and moved with purpose, not uncertainty. They knew where to go. The hidden door, concealed behind a bookcase, was discovered and opened. The space that had held fear, hope, arguments, and dreams was no longer secret. The invisible line between safety and danger vanished in seconds. For those inside, the moment collapsed time. There was no gradual realization, no opportunity to prepare emotionally. Shock replaced anticipation. The threat they had lived with abstractly was now physical, standing in the room. Voices, boots, commands, everything they had learned to avoid filled the annex at once. Anne's diary ended not with a conclusion but with interruption. Her words did not trail off in reflection or farewell. They stopped because writing was no longer possible. The suddenness of that silence is part of its meaning. A voice that had documented life under pressure was cut short by force, not choice. The arrest stripped away identity and privacy at once. Possessions were searched, papers seized, order imposed. Years of discipline and restraint offered no protection now. The rules had changed, and there was no adaptation left to make. The hidden life ended not with resistance, but with removal. What followed was disorientation. The annex, once claustrophobic, was left behind. Exposure replaced confinement, but not freedom. The transition was not relief, it was vulnerability. Outside, the occupied city continued its routines, largely unaware of the small tragedy unfolding inside one building. The betrayal itself remains unresolved, a gap in the historical record that resists closure. Names have been suggested, theories constructed, evidence weighed and reweighed. But certainty has never arrived. This absence of clarity underscores a larger truth. Persecution did not require villains to be known, only systems willing to act on information. With the arrest, Anne Frank ceased to be a hidden girl and became a prisoner of the machinery she had been writing against. The secret annex, once a place of constrained survival, became a memory. What remained were pages left behind, words that survived even when the life that produced them was forced into silence. After the arrest, the transition from hiding to captivity was abrupt and disorienting. The annex had been a place of fear, but also of familiarity. What followed was something colder and more impersonal. Anne and the others were processed, transported, and reduced to numbers within a system designed not for control alone, but for erasure. There was no space for individuality, no patience for weakness, and no recognition of the inner lives they carried with them. The journey through transit camps marked the beginning of separation from everything that had once felt stable. Crowded conditions, hunger, and uncertainty replaced the tense routines of hiding. Time no longer moved in measured days, but in forced marches and waiting without explanation. Anne, who had once filled pages with reflection, now lived in a world where survival consumed all attention. As deportations continued eastward, the scale of the system became unavoidable. Trains carried human beings in sealed compartments, stripped of dignity and clarity about where they were going. The landscape passed unseen. For many, the journey itself became a breaking point. For Anne, adolescence continued even here, but under conditions that offered no protection for vulnerability. Arrival at the camps meant another transformation. Families were separated. Order was enforced through shouting, violence, and exhaustion. Identity dissolved into categories imposed by guards and routines. Anne's ability to observe and articulate the world, so vivid in her diary, now had no outlet. Her voice did not disappear because it lacked meaning, but because the environment allowed none. Illness and deprivation followed predictably. Bodies weakened, and resilience was tested daily. The imaginative, energetic girl who had once dreamed of becoming a writer now faced a reality that resisted narrative. The future, once imagined even in hiding, narrowed to the next hour. The next roll call, the next night survived. Anne Frank did not live to see liberation. Her death occurred within a system that left little record of individual endings. What makes this absence so powerful is not only the loss of a life, but the silencing of a perspective still in formation. Her story ended not because it had reached completion, but because history intervened with finality. What survived Anne was not her body, but her words. The diary, rescued and preserved, carried her voice beyond the camps that erased her physical presence. It spoke not with the authority of hindsight, but with the immediacy of lived experience. Readers encountered not a victim frozen in time, but a thinking, questioning human being growing under impossible conditions. The power of the diary lies in its specificity. Anne did not write in abstractions. She wrote about irritation, longing, conflict, hope, and doubt. These details anchored history in personality. Through her, the Holocaust ceased to be only numbers and policies. It became rooms, arguments, silences, and dreams interrupted. Over time, her words crossed borders and generations. Translated, taught, and debated, the diary reached audiences far removed from its origin. Its impact did not depend on scale, but on intimacy. Readers recognized themselves in her thoughts, and through that recognition, grasped the magnitude of what was lost. Anne Frank's legacy is not one of resolution or closure. Her diary does not offer answers to suffering or redemption through survival. Instead, it insists on remembrance grounded in humanity. It reminds the world that genocide destroys not only lives, but futures, voices that might have shaped culture, thought, and understanding. In the end, Anne Frank became something she once hoped for, a writer whose words mattered, not because she sought fame, but because her honesty endured. The war ended, regimes fell, and borders shifted. Her voice remained. In surviving the war, her diary ensured that silence would not have the final word.